Okay, we're recording. I am Brandon Polite, professor of philosophy at Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois, and I'm joined by Stephanie Patridge, who is professor emerita in philosophy at Otterbein University. In her retirement, she's been teaching classes in ethics and human rights at the University of Iowa. Steph, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Brandon, for having me. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. We're talking about your work on snobbery, and for
hmm
anyone who wants a taste of your view on snobbery, they could read your terrific paper, Snobbery in Appreciative
hmm
Context,
That's
from the
right.
British Journal of Aesthetics in 2018.
hmm
But since then, you've been thinking more about snobbery and are developing it into a book. And so,
hmm
I guess to start off, could you tell us a bit about the project, and then we'll get into the specifics of what snobbery is, whether it's good to be a snob or bad to be a snob, and so forth.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much. Um, when I wrote that paper, I really just all things are kind of accidental. Many things are accidental, most things are accidental. And I accidentally came across Kieran's groundbreaking paper on snobbery. And it frustrated me. I felt like things were missing. And I then wrote that piece that you're mentioning to try to think of other ways that you might be a snob that Karen had missed. And since then, Zoe Johnson King's also written another paper in that kind of little suite of papers. And it's actually kind of a frustrating distinction. You might like the paper or line of discussion. I think what's happened there, it's interesting, but in that little discussion, the issue is really very narrow. It's only about the ways that the character vice of snobbery can undermine particular aesthetic judgments, like this wine is positively Zen-like or whatever, right? So it's like this super narrow technical debate that's kind of boutiquey. It's interesting to maybe philosophers of art, but maybe not that much, not interesting beyond that. Um, and so I kind of started thinking more about snobbery and really once you started thinking about just kind of seeing snobbery everywhere in my experience. I actually come from a working class background. I grew up in a trailer and becoming a philosopher of art is quite a cultural uh, shift. And so in a way, in the second half of my career, it feels like this was the project I was actually always meant to be. I feel a little bit like I got Pygmalioned, like coming through philosophy of art. And so now I'm kind of thinking critically actually about that. Um, the project is really a project that's trying to bring snobbery holistically into focus so that we can kind of see what it is, but also see what it isn't, because I think there's a lot of kind of misunderstanding of snobbery and attributions of snobbery that are not accurate. And also to kind of see why it matters. And I think you can stop me anytime, but let me just say a little bit here. I think it matters pretty substantively culturally. Um, I think that snobbery is probably one of the central issues actually of our time. I think that attributions of snobbery and correct or incorrect play a huge role in our current culture wars. Liberal coast. I'm in Seattle right now, and I can tell you that I do feel some snobbery here from my friends. And the liberal coastal elites are thought to kind of like snobbishly look down on, you know, rural American kind of rubes who live in the middle of the country. And I actually think this correct attributions and misattributions of snobbery really play a significant role in political polarization. I also think there are distinct kinds of moral snobbery. And so I just think snobbery as itself is a really rich, interesting vice that we really should pay attention to, and really no one is paying attention to it except for that little boutique conversation that I mentioned at the beginning.
Yeah, awesome. So, I mean, let's just get into it. What is snobbery
Okay.
and what is not snobbery, right? That you want to make
Okay.
the distinction between those two
Yeah.
things. So, what is snobbery in
Yeah.
your view?
Well, You could start with an etymology. It's a little bit helpful, actually. Snobbery is this very new term. Actually, it doesn't come up until the I think 1830 in Britain in particular as a term for a cobbler. So a person who fixes shoes. They don't think it has any it may not have any normative connotations. Pretty quickly, it weirdly becomes somebody who has bad taste, is vulgar, is of poor breeding. So it's a kind of like attribution that people who have lower status actually have. It then becomes a kind of Thackeray writes this book, The Book of Snobs, where we see he's making fun of people that are snobs all over the place. Those snobs are people who are like mockable because they're trying to raise their social status by um, associating themselves with lower class things, people, and they're kind of failing. So they're kind of like failed social climbers. We do have that use. We still use that way of thinking about snobbery. It's maybe not this. If I ask you to think of a snob, maybe that isn't what would come to your mind. But we say things like, "Oh, you only like that wine because you think it's going to make you fancy. Stop being a snob." We do use that conception. Isn't until like 1930 that we get something that looks more like what we would, I think, would be our paradigm case of snob, which comes out of George Bernard Shaw's Getting Married. Sorry, it's paradigmatically there. And that's somebody who has high status already, so they're not social climbing. They are in that status, and they look down on those that they perceive to be their inferiors. Those are kind of the two main ways that we use in our culture right now the term snob. Both look like they share something in common, and that is that they are concerned with status and social hierarchy, and they take social hierarchy, status, prestige, and I'm just using those, I'm borrowing those terms from sociology and I'm using them interchangeably here, that they think those things actually are valuable. Those are things that are actually good and they make a person a better person. And that's kind of what it looks like is at the core of snobbery, is this endorsement of prestige value, of social hierarchy, and a deep connection to how the value of a person qua person in a sense.
Yeah, so the social climber sense of
Hmm.
snob that's no longer central makes sense on that conception,
Yeah.
right? That if your attitude is that these sorts of things give someone prestige, right? And so acquiring a taste for those things and a preference for those things then indicates, oh, I'm better than these other people. Right? That these fancy wines
Yeah.
versus, the boxed wine or whatever.
Yeah, and I mean that sounds like when you say I'm better than these other people, I think you're recognizing something actually right, which is nobody is really a pure Thackeray snob or a pure Shaw snob. They probably are kind of a mix of both. And so while the person is like, I want to be fancy, and so I want to be around these fancy things, right? Striving and really valuing in that this isn't a strategic kind of like I'm working class, I need to learn how to golf in order to make money. This is a real endorsement, seeing these things as good making features of human beings. At the same time, they probably are also going to be looking down on their kind of inferior. So they're really the Kieran paper that I mentioned at the beginning, where he's talking about undermining aesthetic judgment. He's using also just that Thackeray notion. So he thinks a judgment is snobbish to the extent that it's made by attending to prestige value of the aesthetic object rather than its aesthetic value. So he's also doing a kind of Thackeray analysis of snobbery even there too. So, and he thinks it's the paradigm. I don't think it's our paradigm, but who knows what we all have differently. That's a social concept, it's kind of messy and
Yeah, it seems like the Shaw conception is definitely the paradigm when the word snob is thrown around these days. It's more
yeah, you're like the person
looking
that's like,
down at the
right.
lesser
Yes,
people,
totally.
right?
Yeah.
And one thing that's interesting is that it comes out of it's a term that comes from cobblers, right? It's a
Mm-hmm.
term that's just used as someone who fixes shoes. And I wonder,
Mm-hmm.
I was talking to our pal Aaron Meskin like a day or
Mm-hmm.
two ago, and
Mm-hmm.
apparently there was a difference in guilds between shoemakers and
Mm-hmm.
shoe repairers, right?
Mm-hmm.
And cobblers are the people who fix shoes. They weren't the people that make
Correct.
shoes. And so
Right.
presumably they're going to be below the shoemakers, right? And so
Yes.
I wonder if that's where like the sense of lesser and social climbing, right?
Yeah. I don't think we know the answer to that, but
Yeah.
that sounds like a very nice story to be told about how it so easily gets co-opted. I mean, there's a bit in there I didn't, it becomes a kind of slang for townies by the Cambridge County crowd. So it goes through these little kind of evaluative permutations to finally, it almost feels like a natural trajectory once you see that to the Thackeray conception where he's like, oh yeah, and these people are like, these vulgar people are trying to use our cultural stuff to become fancy and look how bad they are at it.
So it's like the townies showing up at the Cambridge like
Kind of, yeah.
soirees, right? And
Mhm.
like, I fit
Yeah.
in here, right? And so
Yeah.
that's where the social climber notion
Uh-huh.
may come in. That's
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah. And there's some, are you asking about that? I mean, there's some reason for that probably that we don't see it till then, right? Because, you know, there's you really need some ability to actually status climb in order for it to be a threat to status in any kind of way, and for it even to think about it in this kind of way. What's happening in that time? The reduction of the economic power of right the gilded
Hmm.
class and the rise or the aristocratic class, sorry, and the rise of right people who get quite wealthy through manufacturing, and there's a kind of like need to secure your status from the kind of uprising. And what can they not do? They can, you're hearing a little my suspicion of this Thackeray conception here.
Yeah.
They can't, they don't have good taste, they have bad manners, they can't, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
They
They
don't
don't
fit,
fit
they don't
in.
fit in. Yeah,
They don't fit in polite society,
correct.
right? They're
Yeah,
too uncultured, right? So,
right.
uh, yeah, yeah. So the I don't know, the chimpanzee may prefer like this Riesling to that one, but
Mhm.
that doesn't indicate that they're one of us, right?
Right. Yeah,
Who are the aristocratic Cambridge educated type
yeah.
person.
And culture is just so like culture of manners, which is deeply aesthetic, right? As we know,
Yeah.
sartorial expression, facility with food and wine and art and literature and poetry. Uh, that's as a person who's like counts for a trailer, that shit's really hard to feign, right? Like,
Yeah.
I mean, you really have to be enculturated and kind of the goalpost can move kind of easily, particularly with manners and fashion. What's gauche one day is right
Yeah.
cool another day, and so they function really quite well even if there are kind of some standards. They still can function quite well as a kind of gatekeeping device. So I
Yeah. And
mean, and we
some
also get like nouveau riche at that time, parvenu, all these kind of terms all arise at the same time as snob, so in
yeah.
English. So
And something you just said sort of triggered a sort of core memory for me
uh-huh.
is I come from a very working class background, although I didn't grow up in a trailer.
It was
And
double
I,
wide, so it's fancy.
okay, but well, you had one of the fancy trailers, yeah.
Yes.
But I just remember freshman year of college being in a like intro to lit course
Mhm.
and going around and like each of us was like reading something and like I'm like thinking how many people ahead I am, so
Mhm.
like what I'm gonna read, and I see this word and I don't know what this word or this phrase and I have no idea what it is, how to pronounce it. It was hors d'oeuvres.
Oh my
Right?
gosh,
It's
can
a
you imagine how
word I
hard that would
knew.
be?
I'd heard
Yeah.
it spoken.
Well, it starts with an
I'd
H.
I'd I knew what it meant, but hors d'oeuvres, like
Yeah.
what the hell is this, right? And so like
Right.
it's like, oh shit, I'm gonna have to read this. I'm gonna have to read this. And then fortunately, like my counting was off, so the person before me did it. I was like,
Oh, right.
oh, but just
Wow,
like
you still remember that.
the
Yeah,
deep
that's
anxiety of
yeah.
I'm gonna be exposed as like an
Right.
uncultured person.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, right. Stats anxiety is real.
Yeah.
I mean, for all of us.
Yeah.
I mean, there's some like researchers, I'm not one for evolutionary accounts just because it's outside my skill set, but clearly we're creatures of evolution and evolution is going to do some explanatory work here. But there's just just to research, it feels like status is so part of our DNA that it's almost can't get rid of it. Like, some people joke you put two people in a room and they just start trying to jockey for a position to figure out who's the smarter, who's got the better job, who's got the right. Um, I don't think, I have some hope that we could be generous and hope that no, we don't necessarily have to do that, but it seems pretty significantly part of our social lives.
Yeah, it may be hardwired in a way that like we have to consciously, actively seek to overcome it.
Yeah, or do some versatilian habituating.
Yeah.
Mhm. Or
Exactly. Okay,
unhabituating.
cool. So how do you think snobbery functions today? I mean, you're thinking of it largely along the Shaw lines,
Mhm.
right? And so can you talk a bit more about that and then we can get to the question of like why should we care about snobbery, which
Yeah.
we're touching on already. It has to do with prestige, status, etc.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, sorry, you asked me about, so you're like, we were
Just
in the past,
more
now
about the
we're,
George Bernard Shaw
yeah.
conception of snobbery, how that
Yeah.
functions.
Yeah. How it functions today, you're asking?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so I can give you an example. I've had loads of examples while I'm here in Seattle. I went to grad school here, so I know lots of people here. One thing, I'll give you one little teeny example that seems mundane, but it was just so rich. So I'm in this kind of pretty hoity-toity kind of neighborhood in the center of the city, and I was invited to a gathering for some neighbors to very kind gesture. I was like, oh, great, I'll get to meet you guys. And I was introduced as the person who was visiting from Iowa, which was a shock even to me because I've been there long, but you have to get used to those changes. And I'm from Ohio, so four letters, but very different. So I walked in, and the first thing that somebody said to me was, well, I mean, if you're a Trump voter, you're going to be really uncomfortable around here. And I was just like, wow, oh my God. I felt so taken aback and I'm just really confused by that. Like, why did I feel personally like affronted? I'm not a Trump voter. Um, and I don't think it was that I was being assumed. Like, I don't think it was a factual error that was so troubling to me. It was something about the claim that I was like being put in my place, kind of right there. I was being looked down on, even just kind of because of this geographic kind of conception. Throughout the evening, people made fun of a kind of there's this really popular winery here. It's a big corporate winery, and they make a very palatable Riesling for under like $10, right? And they are just like running that down. Turns out they all worked in the wine industry, so they have good palate. So then that was confusing to me. Why was I bothered? I started defending the winery and and then they started running down country music and the sartorial expressions of, and then I was like, well, I like some country music. And then I said to get out. Like I was so uncomfortable. And it was just so confusing to me, but I really felt personally affronted. And I think there are high key kind of political examples of people being snobbish, but there's just this kind of also just everyday kind of snobbery that is deeply insulting to the target's very person because they're being disrespected in a really intense kind of way. So I'll just leave that as a kind of just a kind of mundane, boring example that I think are just like rife through our kind of ordinary kinds of experiences. Um, so I'll stop there just to talk about kind of as a contemporary example.
Yeah, right. And it's
But
deeply
I don't know. Sorry, go ahead.
it's just deeply presumptive, right? They just hear the word Iowa and then all
Mhm.
of these negative associations come out. Trump voter, rural, right? Conservative country music,
Yeah.
denim
There's
overalls, like,
Yeah, there's probably some reason that they were talking about country music and it probably had associate. I don't know that, right? But
mhm.
it certainly felt like these things were a little bit of a piece. Um, yeah, and so yeah, sorry, I don't have anything else to say there.
Yeah,
I think that's right. I think that it can get bound up with issues clearly of class
yeah,
and race, gender, these sort of things. And then like the place that the snob puts you on. So like it's one thing to have like just some jerky neighbor be a jerk to me, even though it was like really offensive and I was confused. That's part of like the motivation of this book in some ways is really to try to get straight about examples like that. Like, what were they being snobs? Like, was that example of their wine judgment, which was actually they have pretty significant wine knowledge? Was that different than the like they definitely didn't know anything about country music, the kind of things that they said about country music? What if I had been a Trump voter? What does all this have to do with political polarization? I think it does have quite a bit to do with political polarization. What does this have to do with social justice? Again, the place they put me on, it was just kind of like an interpersonal wrong. But when class gets involved or other kinds of issues, now they're slotting you on a place where that place is actually also partly constructed by our shared kind of social understanding. It makes it a lot more pernicious, has significant outcomes for people's health and well-being and sense of self-respect. So when you get groups in here, and again, class is really the obvious case, it gets a lot more troubling. And now we add kind of politics to this, and we can start to see how we can we can see there's at least a conception that the left are snobbish to right conservative voters, and so right can help contribute then even kind of these ordinary interpersonal experiences to the feeling of affront and insult and right not being respected.
yeah. And I mean, related to that a bit, right? That maybe the flip side of it is, as someone who lives in the Midwest as well, especially during, the worst part of the pandemic, going to certain places wearing a mask,
Mm-hmm.
I would be ostracized immediately, right? Like, oh, you're
Mm-hmm.
one of them liberal
Mm-hmm.
elites, right? I'm
Yeah.
like, no, I just don't want to get COVID and give it to my kids. Like,
Yeah.
very straightforward, science-based stuff,
Right.
right? It's just like, feeling, it's not snobbery there, right?
Right.
But it's a different form of arrogance, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's right that that those kinds of things got bound up with conceptions that look very much like they probably are snobbery, thinking that you're expressing your kind of attitude of being better than they are
Mhm.
through your kind of mask wearing. And like, frankly, these kind of expressive activities are very core to how we express. I'm not claiming you're mask wearing. I'm just saying like it's misfiring there, but it's not always misfiring.
Yeah.
But why is it misfiring? I think because we're just so sensitive to personal affronts of our dignity in that kind of way. And particularly when you wrap class in it, then like it just feels so raw and so like so insulting, right? So that
Hmm.
we get some kind of misfiring. I think there's also just a confusion sometimes between um having status in a domain. So having a certain kind of skill set, being a doctor, being a librarian, being an academic. Um, I'll just leave those examples there, that there's some confusion and sometimes thinking that those are anti-hierarchical themselves or anti-egalitarian, and them telling me what to think, science or whatever, that's a kind of like affront to my person that gets kind of bound up in this similar kind of thing. And those are cases where it's actually kind of important to be able to distinguish um, non-snobbish ways of engaging, but also spheres of expertise from kind of a more clearly snobbish, Shaw-like attitudinal kind of snobbery, which is the thing we care more about than Thackeray snob.
Yeah, right. That there's a difference between domains like aesthetic ones where, when, matters of taste are much more subjective than issues of medicine, public health, uh, science, climate change, et cetera, right? That those are empirically based in a way that, the aesthetic domain is much more bound up with preferences, in a way that like science isn't straightforwardly bound up in preferences. Medicine isn't
Hmm.
straightforwardly bound up in preferences.
Hmm. Yeah, but when those get connected to the people who are thought to be snobbish
Yeah.
elites, then we have this problem of spillover.
Yeah.
Um, and liberal, elites are not super good at not being snobbish too, so it doesn't help the matter very much that we're pretty good at it.
Yeah, the elites are making it worse for the rest of us.
Yeah,
Definitely.
yeah, and contributing to, I think, the um, fractured kind of political landscape that we see.
Yeah, yeah. And just the attitude of, oh, you listen to country music, therefore you are lesser than me who listens to like
Right.
Tchaikovsky or whatever.
Yeah, right. Yes. Like the world of country music is quite rich and
Yeah.
interesting.
Rich, diverse, interesting. Yeah. And as you pointed out before, these people have bad taste in country just because they haven't really fully exposed themselves to it. They don't know those distinctions between various genres and subgenres in the history and so forth, right? And so who are they to judge country as a whole with this sort of, really wide brush when
Yeah.
there's a lot of nuance, subtlety, a lot of distinctions to be made there.
Yeah. I mean, if it's fine to say I don't like country music, I don't know country, like you don't have to like everything,
Yeah.
but their engagement was like it was clear that that they were really thinking, and these fans with their shit kicking boots come into the city and they're just kind of loot like they're lower, right?
Hmm.
And so, you know, you can definitely have preferences and you can definitely, um, but this is definitely kind of a hierarchical kind of thinking that was going on there. And it's really common. It's hard. I mean, it's common even among thinking people. It's really hard to resist this kind of um status hierarchy. I mean, status is just so attractive. It so easily just gets bound up in these judgments, even when we're kind of trying not to. So it's really challenging to try your best to try to not do that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so, how does this relate then to the field of aesthetics? I mean, obviously through the
Yeah.
issue of taste, which we've been talking about
Yeah.
a bit, but you said that issues relating to manners are heavily bound up with aesthetic concerns. And
Yeah.
so, how does the snobbery discussion relate to issues in aesthetics?
Yeah. I mean, I think just in the ways that you've identified right there, Brendan, um, I do think part of the reason here is has to do with something that you pointed out, which is that the standards are not, if there are standards, that they're not empirically verifiable in the same way that other kinds of domains have that. So they're kind of easy in that way. But I also think it's possible that it really just has something to do with the way that this whole system of snobbery has gotten off the ground because of elite tastemakers kind of doing all this kind of work in the manners and including the aesthetic manners, your tone of voice, how you move your body, right? What fork you use. Those are not just like factual things. Those aren't just evaluative things. Those are also like deeply aesthetic, how you move your body, what your body type is. I think that the elites just like grabbed that stuff. I am a philosopher, so this is like a story from a philosopher sitting in their armchair, but grab that stuff and it just works so well here. And really what we're seeing is just the continuation of this kind of like elite tastemakers. They make the standards at that time, and then those standards really are still in place. We do see a kind of trend towards omnivorism, but that trend is pretty patterned. It looks a lot like I'm not all elites, my friend. It looks like elites kind of like looking down and like finding those things that they think are actually worthy and then pulling them up to elite status. And very often, like just using the same tools, aesthetic tools they use to understand elite artworks rather than trying to understand them on their own. So you can go to an art museum and you see like, decks of skateboards on the wall, which is just such a confusing way to think about like skateboards and skateboarding culture and the aesthetics of those things and how they function. Um, it's patterned in the way that what doesn't seem to make the list is the cultural objects of poor whites, right? So the food of poor whites doesn't get enfranchised. The culture of poor whites doesn't tend to get enfranchised. Exception maybe a punk rock, but country music, heavy metal, these kinds of things that are the domains of are still the kinds of things that you're normatively allowed to hate because you're still normatively allowed to disrespect those kinds of people, which get bound up with all these kind of political judgments, I think.
Yeah, that seems exactly right. And one thing, as you were talking, I had this thought that, um, the aesthetic domain, as we're talking about, is mm, very it's non-empirical largely. Judgments are subjective by their nature, and you could see how these things come apart with respect to like the ranking of films on IMDb, which are
Mm-hmm.
user fan scores
Mm-hmm.
versus like AFI, BFI top 100, right? On
Mm-hmm.
IMDb, I think the top movie of all time is Shawshank Redemption.
Oh, is it? I didn't know.
I
Wow, that's
think
really
I don't know if it
useful.
still is, but for years it was. Whereas, if it's AFI, BFI, it's going to be,
Yeah.
Vertigo, Citizen Kane, Tokyo
Yeah.
Story, like,
Yeah. And those are
those
great
movies.
films.
Yeah, yeah, but like, the hoi polloi, the ordinary folks,
Right.
right? For them, it's Shawshank Redemption all
Right.
the way. Whereas for the experts, it's, this set of films. And,
Yeah.
um, I think that, a lot of those experts can be like, yeah, Shawshank Redemption is fantastic. Maybe some
Right.
of them may not have a snobbish attitude toward it. Maybe some of them
Right.
do,
Right.
right? Whereas, you can imagine some people, think Shawshank Redemption number one all the way would have an attitude of, well, if these experts think, these films are good, then therefore, because the elite, they're therefore bad, right?
Oh, you mean the reverse?
Yeah, like
Yeah,
reverse
yeah, yeah, yeah,
snobbishness.
yeah, yeah. In a sense, yeah, reverse snobbishness, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Or also they look down on me because I like Shawshank Redemption, or yeah,
Yeah.
it's all very. These are like social concepts, and they don't always play nice, and they can
Yeah.
be pressed in all kinds of service. There is. I mean, I would resist. I just used the word I think of reverse snobbery, so maybe I
Yeah.
would do it this way. But I think there are like localized snobberies
Yeah.
in the sense that you know, you get a distinct like you and I were both at a conference and we talked about record stores and I a lot of experience in kind of record stores with corporate record stores, but also like third wavy kind of record stores. Sorry, third place kind of record stores.
Yeah.
And I mean, I promise you, you were being judged when you bought a record that they were not just like, oh, you're buying this. They're like, and you're kind of like a loser for
Yeah.
buying this kind of thing. And those kind of standards that are internal to that domain are going to be different than the standards that we'd find kind of in our ordinary culture. They're going to be different than the standards that we'll find in, you know, um, an MLS team, which is going to have a kind of, fandom kind of world. It's going to have a different kind of localized set of standards. What counts as status there will be different. Those things are probably a lot less pernicious than our kind of like shared background issue, considerations of class and race and gender, but they still are real. They still can, they still sting their targets. They still cause insult. So we might have moral kind of reason to worry about them, but maybe not necessarily some kind of political kind of reason to worry about them. They don't
Yeah.
tend to be totally isolated too, because like, sexism falls in, gets through the cracks, racism
Yeah.
gets through the cracks in most of these localized worlds. So they're not completely walled off from the outside world, but they do nevertheless have their own different social standards. So they could look upside down, as it were, from the standards that we'd see in our larger culture.
Yeah, right. You've got like the stereotypical record shop owner from High Fidelity, right? John Cusack's
Mhm.
character. And I'm sure you experienced a lot of
It's no
guys
joke.
like that. And it's certainly gendered in that world.
Mhm.
Only serious collectors are men, right? Women aren't serious collectors. And oh,
Yeah, you're posers. You're actually a Thackeray
yeah.
snob in a sense, right? You're just trying to act like you're sorry, I didn't interrupt you.
No, no, I think that's absolutely right that you're a poser.
Yeah.
You don't belong here, right? In some
Hmm.
sense. And you're trying to get some
Hmm.
sort of social status or
Yeah.
clout or
Yeah.
prestige by
Yeah.
even entering into this space and thinking that you can engage with us in any
Yeah.
reasonable sort of way.
I mean, you can feel that like you just can't, Snobbery is everywhere. Like it's just really hard to. Once you start seeing it, you can see it everywhere, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Hopefully I'm not
Abs
oversensitive to snobbery, but yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, I've been to a lot of record shops. I haven't been to a lot of record shops where I've experienced anything like that. And I think it's largely because most record shops now are just desperate to
Yeah.
hang on. And so they want to
Yeah.
be as welcoming as possible. But I have experienced like, oh, you want a Rush record? Okay.
Hmm.
Like I'll find a Rush record for you. Sure. Like
Yeah. Yeah.
that's not
Yeah.
serious music.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, cool. So maybe somewhat related to this
Hmm.
um is snobbery ever good? Like can there
Yeah.
be
So I,
good forms of
yeah.
snobbery, right?
I
That
get asked versions of that question a lot. And first I was really taken aback. I was like, what? I mean, isn't the word just sound bad? I don't understand why we would think that. I get asked versions of this question all it doesn't like it's not like it just comes from elite people like, people I just meet ask me these kinds of questions. I mean, it does come from artists, architects, philosophers, but it comes from just like I'm going to use the word ordinary human, and that is really not the right word to use in a conversation about snobbery. A person who doesn't have a stake in this elite game, maybe. I don't know, right?
yeah.
Yeah. Person who's not a artist or an academic. How about that?
Yeah, yeah.
Um, and what do they ask me? So they ask me things like, so you're going to defend snobbery, right? And they're like dead serious. Like they really think that's the obvious thing to be doing is to be defending snobbery. And so they're clearly they think there's some virtue that you wouldn't want to get rid of it. I doubt they would think it's always good, but I think that they think it can be sometimes good. I get asked sometimes almost immediately at something like this that sounds very similar. I think these are all bound up, which is like, well, but of course there's something like good taste. And so I think there's some kind of suspicion that like taste and snobbery are so interlocked that if you actually took snobbery seriously, you'd have to get rid of taste. And so, well, we want taste, so we guess we're gonna have to accept there's some good snobbery. I was with an architect just last weekend, and she's like, "What, you're gonna have to distinguish between good snobbery, right, and bad snobbery." Where again, I think she means actually just um, having taste. So it's worth talking about that a little bit, I think. Um, so I actually don't think there's good snobbery. I mean, I think you could have instrumental reasons maybe for, except for in some rare cases that maybe we can talk about. But in general, I don't think there is good snobbery. I think snobbery is pernicious in the ways that we've discussed. And the phenomena that they're talking about, you can vindicate while still taking snobbery very seriously.
Yeah,
Does that make
and
sense?
so what about here's an example.
Mhm.
Donald Trump and his, say, hairdo, his sartorial choices with the
Yeah.
extra long ties, right, that look weird, his
Mhm.
golden toilet, right, which is just tacky as all get out, right? Like it seems like there are cases like that where it can be like, no, he has bad taste, and there's a sense in which we should feel superior
Hmm.
in that case. And maybe that's an
Yeah.
outlier type case that could be bound up
Yeah.
with political and other judgments,
I
right?
think that's right, Brandon. Oh, sorry, good.
No, because he's a billionaire and therefore above us, the rest of us in
Hmm.
some sense, right? That,
Hmm.
punching up seems appropriate,
Hmm.
right? But I don't know. That seems to be a case where like I kind of feel not too bad about
You
looking
want to be able
down
to
my
hang on
nose.
to it, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, there's some complicated things to say here that maybe I'll try to resist that. But part of when we're insulting him, we're calling him nouveau riche, right? Or
Yeah.
Thackeray snobbering him. We really need to think about that concept. I do think the fact that you're punching up, like part of what I think, let's see how hard this is to get out, is that those kind of Thackeray conceptions of snobbery, again, those conceptions of snobbery are when you're accusing somebody of social climbing, of liking things because you think it'll raise your social status and because you like really value prestige social status, right? You think these things are good because they have that and they'll bring it to you. Um, and when we talk about his particularly golden toilet and kind of flashy interior, not maybe his hairdo, but or his sartorial expression, but his like interior design choice that we see, right, is like lots of gilded, lots of gold. Um, that the fact that social location matters. If we were punching down, I don't think that those attributions of snobbery are actually accurate. We shouldn't make them. Punching up is useful. Sorry, it's at least cleared one bar, I think, for me. Partly for those reasons we said in the beginning, which is like, think about the function of that term. It's really gatekeeping for elites to try to keep that's how it's traditionally, right, functioned as a kind of gatekeeping device. And we do want to a little bit worry about that. At the same time, like when people are buying into all that, you want to be able to make some kind of criticism of that. I think there's something there. So that's complicated. But I also think sometimes we're doing some attitudinal shit, right? Like we're like, yeah, he's just a look at that guy. I do think he's probably an outlier. I think that this is all assuming that he is kind of like a pretty repulsive human being morally, not aesthetically, and is maybe even a danger to a democracy. That what it means to show respect for that person is just different. The obligations of respect are different because that person is kind of unique. But I would caution to go back to my concerns about political polarization that there are a lot of people who identify with him. This insult that we have done, which is that Donald Trump is a poor conception, sorry, is a poor man's conception of a rich man, is probably somewhat accurate. And when we insult Trump, by proxy, people feel that they're also being affronted because if they had money, that is how they would spend their money because that seems to be something that is like beautiful. And so I feel like it's complicated. I feel like, yes, it is possible that that the requirements of respect are different, but there are also consequential kind of considerations that we'd want to bear in mind in thinking that. I think like not just respect in the on the pro insult side, it can do a lot of work. It can bond people together through humor, which I've written a lot on, and humor is such a social glue, right? Like we laugh even when we're just saying yes, you know what I mean? Like we really like right now, I'm like laughing as a way of kind of being affirming, right? Um, and it can do a kind of lot of community building. And so there's kind of, there's a lot of things also consequentially that it can do good. So I guess I just want to say it's really complex, I think. And I don't have a kind of all in judgment there. I just think we at least would want to be cautious about it.
Yeah, and I think that a parallel case to Trump would be a rapper starts to become more popular, get more money, and they start blinging out as a way of indicating
Exactly.
social status and prestige. And if I were to see a magazine
Same thing.
with a picture that's identical to Trump's bathroom,
Hmm.
right, and it turns out that it was I don't know Snoop Dogg's bathroom, I'd be like, wow, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Right. Whereas I find out it's Trump, I'm like, oh, that sucks. He's
No,
awful. Of
right.
course he would think that's good looking.
So interesting how differently we read all of this stuff, like how differently we read beauty standards when we conceptualize the person in a certain kind of way. I think there are a lot of people, though, elites, who would look at the rapper's
Yeah.
bathroom where you get race stuff kind of bound in here and have the same kind of like some people have
Oh, of
argued that like
course
that's
they
just
would. Yeah.
racism, that's not snobbery. No, my friend, those are all like, the person who feels it feels that it's snobbish and racist in together, right? Like
Yeah.
that. I think racism, sexism, all this kind of stuff is, and classism is all kind of bound with snobbery. It's just all stitched in there. So it's
Yeah.
like such an important vice. It's so you can just feel that we're barely scratching the surface of it here.
Yeah, that seems exactly right. And so this is
Mhm.
something we've talked about a bit, but how do we untangle taste from snobbery, right? That it seems like we have this conception of some people have good taste, some people have bad taste, at least
Mhm.
in certain domains.
Yeah.
And we talk about how, my taste is refined over the years, right? I have
Mhm.
better taste now than I did when I was 15. Um,
Mhm.
Largely. Uh, okay, my taste is mostly the same since I was 15, but with respect to some things, it's better. Um, uh, and that seems to be an indication of, well, there are some hierarchies here, right? That
Mhm.
there are some hierarchies here. And uh, so how do we disentangle taste from snobbery, or can they be, fully disentangled from one another?
I think they can. I'm a pretty radical pluralist. Um, I think there kind of are always just reasons here, and reasons are very domain specific. I'm not alone in thinking that, right? It's, kind of a central view going right now in aesthetics. I think that I don't think there is anything so like virtue Aristotelians who did virtue aesthetics, sorry, that kind of early part of virtue aesthetics. Sorry, I just got a spam call. I don't know how to stop that, but anyway, I can stop it. Um, I think those people said like good taste is part of eudaimonia, like it's part of flourishing. And there it just sounds like good taste is like elite conception of good taste. That is not right. That's snobbish. And I think there probably isn't any such thing as good taste. There's no general, you have good taste, this other person has bad taste. If there is, and this is a big if there is a defensible conception of good taste, those things have to be deeply domain specific so that nobody has good taste. Somebody might have good taste on this conception, which I haven't quite got to yet, um, in wine or rap music or country music. Probably nobody, hardly anybody even has that. They have like knowledge of a range of wines or knowledge of a like contemporary country music that sounds in a certain kind of way or so it's highly domain specific. It involves, having the things that we would see from Hume, which is right, having kind of a lot of experience. So you've got a lot of knowledge. You can make kind of distinctions here. You can hear, like, I used to try to force my mom to listen to punk rock when I was like 16. And I was just like, no, really listen to it. But of course, she can't listen to that because she has no, it all just sounds like chaos noise to her because she hasn't had kind of the relevant experience to like be able to kind of attune her ears to be able to hear nuances, right? Those things are all real. There are domain specific skills that allow people to, right, see things in a new and richer kind of way. We could call that taste. Does it involve like this is better than that? I don't ever understand really what's at stake with those kind of hierarchical kind of rankings. If we can do that, they're going to be real coarse, I think. Like, a bunch of things are kind of like roughly better, and these kind of things maybe are roughly worse with respect to whatever interest I have in them at that time, a kind of intellectual interest, right? Is it something that I want to watch at the end of the day, or is it something that I want to watch for some kind of intellectual stimulation? Those are all relevant. Um, and I think that if we want to say that is having taste, kind of something more, I think like a skill in a domain, I'm totally fine with that. I think it actually has implications for how we would treat people. We might have a little bit of respect for you as a kind of whatever, a wine connoisseur, a rap connoisseur. Um, it might mean that I would want to seek your advice, for example, if I'm trying to decide what new record to buy or what wine to have with dinner. Though, if it's lost on me, I might not, and who cares? But nothing really follows from that. Like you're a good judge of wine. So what? Like it doesn't make you better than me. And at the same time, once we recognize the domain specificity, we can recognize that there's just so many opportunities for developing um, an expertise in this kind of way, which I think I'd rather use than good taste.
Yeah.
That everybody has bad taste or lacks these kind of skills in just a gajillion domains, right? And just the humility and recognition of that good doesn't track elite, that there's like rich kind of aesthetic experiences all over the place. And so I think you can save something like that so long and try to get rid of the hierarchical kind of stuff.
Yeah,
Or
right.
I
That
hope so.
the stereotypical snob is going to be someone who has expertise and skill with respect to wine, with respect to classical music,
Correct.
architecture, art, those domains.
Jazz gets up there, didn't used to be.
Yeah, right. That those domains associated with the elite, right, with
Mhm.
the affluent, the wealthy, right,
Mhm.
and those are the people with good taste, and their attitude would probably be, "Oh, you have expertise in country music, you have
Right.
expertise
That's
in."
an inferior product. Yeah.
Yeah, in fast food French fries, which
Hmm.
people do care deeply about,
Hmm.
which are the better ones, which are the
Hmm.
worst ones, right? Uh, they're, who gives a shit, right? Like,
Right.
oh, whoopity doo, you're interested in
Yeah.
those things, but that doesn't mean you have good taste.
Yeah.
You have expertise in things that people with bad taste are interested in, right? That these things are
Yeah.
sort of automatically demoted to lesser
Yeah.
than.
But I do think these kind of things enrich your life, right?
Yeah,
But there's
absolutely.
lots of opportunities for enrich your life. So I think they're good making features. They're just not, their absence is not a bad making feature.
Yeah, and I just want to be clear, I wasn't defending that video.
No, I know you weren't. Yeah, yeah. No, no, no.
Just to be
Sorry.
clear,
I
to
think
I
I
yeah.
was me tooing.
Yeah. Okay, good, good,
Yeah,
good.
yeah. I
Um
think we're green. Yeah, yeah. Although it is hard, like, to see the um how much spending a lot of time thinking about French fries is going to be to your life, but
yeah.
it's just not for me.
Yeah, exactly. And one final thought maybe, because we've been
Hmm.
talking for a long time about this, is um it still does feel to me that maybe there are some domains where they're just bad as a whole, right? And um maybe this is a moral judgment, right? But like it isn't clear to me that there's any good Christian rock. Just like it isn't clear to me there's any good Nazi punk, right? That like
Hmm.
it seems like that maybe those genres or those domains, they're just bad, and one really can't refine one's taste with respect to them. And again, maybe that's a
Um,
moral type judgment as a
Nazi punk sounds like you're saying for moral reasons
yeah,
that those are just turned off. So it's like a
yeah,
defeating condition to borrow
yeah,
that language from ethics. That might be right. Just be some things. I mean, that actually goes along with the mistake, like this idea that you can reject the culture of a people if you're allowed to have disdain for them, then you're allowed to have disdain for their culture.
yeah,
And so this is a group where you are allowed to have disdain for them, and so disdain for their culture is not even permitted, but maybe even is warranted.
yeah,
Um, I, I'm of two minds about the hierarchical, like some things are better. I mean, I definitely was brought to think that through my coming to be a person who cares about art. Like I didn't know anything about art until I was in college and I
Same.
had to go to an art museum for writing class. And I was just like, what are these people doing? They're like getting close up and then they're like stepping back. And so I started doing that kind of like feigning kind of activity to go from that to like, somebody who not, knows something about many kinds of art. I think that those things bring a lot of um, enrichment to my life. I do think there are things that if I spent a lot of time with them, probably they wouldn't bring as much enrichment. They'd bring joy in other kinds of ways. I do think having a kind of enriched experience is a good making feature to the extent that you can, given whatever your proclivities are and your uh, capacities are. So I guess I feel too. And then once we start saying like it's better, I just feel like for who, to what? I don't
Yeah.
know. It makes me itchy. So I feel a little conflicted there, and I don't really know what to say about that. So you've definitely hit me in my weak spot when you hit me there. I mean that in a metaphorical sense,
Yeah,
obviously.
right. So on that moment of aporia, right, I
Mhm.
think we'll end the discussion. So, Steph, thank you so
Okay.
much for
Yeah.
joining me. This was an absolutely terrific discussion.
Oh yeah, I was really generous of you to invite me, and I loved talking to you about it, Brandon. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks.
All right, take care.